Now, Germany's generosity towards refugees has been widely reported, but what we don't hear about often is the failed asylum seekers who were sent back home. Amongst the people France 24's Afghanistan team spoke to for today's Focus report is Saeed, who was deported from Germany after living there for 17 years. He's one of tens of thousands of people the Afghan government has committed to readmitting. Mandakini Garlot reports.
A special aircraft, paid for by German authorities, has just landed in Kabul from Munich. It's a 100,000 euros flight that's carrying 18 Afghans back to their country. Among them is this 25-year-old who lived in Europe for 6 years.
The policemen arrested me in the street. They handcuffed me and I spent 2 nights in jail. Then they deported me back here.
This is the third such flight since the signing of a controversial agreement between the European Union and Afghanistan. In exchange for financial assistance, Afghanistan has agreed to take back 80,000 of its citizens whose asylum applications have been rejected. They will return to a country with a rapidly deteriorating security environment. For the moment, they are placed in the Afghan government reception center where they can stay for 2 weeks. After that, they must make their own arrangements. Syed arrived 2 days ago. He suffers from multiple health problems.
Sometimes my breathing stops and I have to use this inhaler.
Syed spent 17 years in Germany. His children are still there, along with most of his brothers and sisters.
I'm ill and I should be at home with someone to take care of me. I'm not able to leave the room alone. Sometimes someone helps me go up and down the stairs, but I'm like a prisoner in this room. Can you pass my phone, please? I need to call someone in Germany.
He contacts his brother for the first time since he arrived in Kabul.
Hello?
Yeah, hello.
Karimjan?
Yeah, this is true.
Masum, azim asum. Azim. Wala faz khuda shel der beder. نه تشویش نمیکنم ما که باز اگه آمد بگو گیران فقانتونش کنیم.
Since the withdrawal of NATO forces in 2014, the number of civilian casualties has continued to rise in Afghanistan. In 2016, a record 11,500 were killed. Terrorist attacks are on the rise all across the country, and Kabul is no exception. Yet, the European Union considers the Afghan capital a safe destination.
It is a safe place compared to the kind of safeness we can expect around the world. As I said before, we experience large-scale terrorist attacks on civilian populations. In Europe, we experience it in Kabul. That is part of the daily risk we all live with.
Are you comparing Kabul's situation to Paris or Berlin's situation?
Yeah, I think that's very pertinent. It was certainly more dangerous to be a citizen in Nice last year than in Kabul. It's also important that Afghans have a realistic expectation that they can't just take off, go to Europe and expect good things will happen. So we avoid these kind of situations.
In Kabul, an NGO is helping the expelled Afghans to find housing and employment and to provide psychological support to those who left the country a long time ago. This family has just been expelled from Norway. The children have never lived in Afghanistan before.
No.
13-year-old Ali was wounded when a bomb exploded in a Shiite mosque just after their arrival.
The bomb blast made me fall to the ground. Then for the next 3 or 4 days, my ears were ringing. I could not hear well. And for 2 or 3 weeks, I had a hard time falling asleep at night. I had nightmares all the time.
Germany has announced plans to expel 12,500 Afghans by the end of 2017.
For more on this, I'm now joined in the studio by Nasim Majidi. She's a migration expert. Hello, thank you very much for your time. Now, what really stood out for me in that report is the EU's ambassador to Afghanistan saying that whether you're living in Paris or Berlin or Kabul, it's all really the same when it comes to security. What's your reaction to that?
Well, clearly that is a political statement and the facts do not back it up. Just last year, the UN Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, so UNAMA, released a report in February 2017 where they reported that it was the highest rate of incidents against civilians ever recorded by the UN. So I think, again, we have the facts to be able to know that the security is only getting worse. And again, a lot of these deportees come back 5, 10, 20 years after they first left. So the initial reasons why they left, the insecurity, have only gotten worse. So they're coming back to a context that they barely know, where they have very few little social networks, and a context in which insecurity is a problem, but many other problems also face them upon return.
And so what's the government doing to help them? We saw how in the report there are NGOs helping people find accommodation, find jobs. What does the government do then?
And again, here, I think it's important to understand the scale of the problem. 6 million refugees returned since 2002, believing in the promises of reconstruction. Now what we see is an Afghan exodus. But Afghanistan has also become a country of forced returns. 1 million Afghans were forced to return in 2016 from Pakistan, Iran, and Europe. So returns from Europe are a drop in a much bigger context of forced returns. And against that, what can the Afghan government do? A government that does not have sufficient independent financial resources, completely dependent on donor countries and external donor agenda. Just to take an example, last year Europe received 1 million migrants and they called it a migration crisis. So when Afghanistan, a country at war, in conflict, and a country that's basically trying to survive political and economic crises, when 1 million of its own citizens return, that's really a crisis that could engender other crises, whether it's economic, social, or political.
So just to clear things up, the 1 million who returned last year, they were forced returns or voluntary ones as well?
These were forced returns from Pakistan. So there's a humanitarian crisis actually happening in the eastern side of Afghanistan, but also from Iran, where migrants are deported every year. About 400,000 are deported from Iran, and also now adding those from Europe.
Now, on Europe, what do you think then? I mean, you mentioned there that here in Europe we say there's a migrant crisis when we're dealing with similar numbers to just 1 year over there. But so Europe then is failing in its responsibilities towards migrants, or do you understand the reasons for striking this deal, for example, with the Kabul government?
And again, Europe might have the right, and states have the right to return or to not accept and then return citizens, asylum seekers who do not pass the test, who fail their applications. But there should be some red lines, and in terms of protection and human rights, Europe should be held more accountable. And there are several ways to that. One should be to know what happens to people after they're returned. So trying to establish a post-return monitoring framework. Right now, there is no capacity, there's no knowledge of NGOs or the UN or any other agency to know what exactly happens. Are these people returned to situations where their lives are under danger, where their families are separated, where children are left on their own? What happens to these people? So a lot of our work on the research side is to try to set up mechanisms to be able to collect that data, because that's, again, when Europe is accountable to know if it's putting people in situations of greater harm than those that they left.
So its responsibility stops when the plane lands. That's it. People get off, and then we don't know what happens to them.
There are different assistance packages given. They're very varied, but really the impact of the assistance is very minimal, very short term. So beyond the short term, yes, we know very little about what happens post-return, and that's really where Europe needs to be more accountable, and where United Nations agencies and NGOs need to step up their effort as well to be able to know when to advocate for people's rights, protection rights, and for do no harm principles. And we should maybe not be returning people to a context where we can't monitor what happens to them.
Now, we talked about the more practical elements, obviously the essential ones of having a roof over your head, having a job so you can afford to feed yourself. But then there's also culturally, I understand, it's difficult for people returning to Afghanistan amongst other countries when they've been away for so long, so it's hard for them to adapt, and also they sometimes encounter the problem of not necessarily being accepted back into society.
Mm-hmm. Of course, and that's where returning people is easy, but reintegration is the toughest part. How do you ensure that people are re-included in societies from an economic standpoint, but much more socially and psychosocially? And most of the research shows that there is this element of stigma and of Afghans being seen as having been contaminated in the West. And again, a lot of the security attacks are also targeted against young, westernized Afghans, and we saw that with the American university bombing last year. So part of the problems that deportees face are not just the insecurity and also access to basic needs. Our research shows, for example, that deportees face a lower rate of education upon return, for example, a higher poverty rate. These are all realities. But on the psychosocial side, what's less visible is the trauma that they've experienced and the lack of any social protection or any specialized service provider who can actually provide the assistance that people need beyond the obvious, beyond the visible, the less visible psychosocial needs that they face.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed for your time and your analysis, Naseem Majidi. Thank you. And thank you for watching Focus. I'll be back in a few minutes with a full news roundup. Don't go away.